Brookdale was the kind of place people described as ordinary, a quiet town tucked between stretches of farmland and rows of neat suburban homes where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Neighbors knew one another, doors were left unlocked, and gossip usually centered on who won the school football game or which family was moving into a new house. That sense of comfort ended one warm evening in June when the town's most familiar face was found dead inside his corner store. The shop had been a fixture for decades, run by a middle-aged man named Harold Greene, who sold everything from candy bars to batteries. He greeted every customer with a smile, and parents trusted their children to walk there alone. On the night of the crime, Harold had been closing the store. The lights were left on, the door left unlocked, and when a neighbor noticed the strange glow long after midnight, she went inside. What she discovered became the headline of every paper in the county. Harold's body lay behind the counter, slumped across the floor. Blood streaked the tiles, the register was open, and a trail of red footprints led toward the back door. The police arrived quickly, sealing off the scene. What began as disbelief soon transformed into fear. Brookdale wasn't the kind of town where murders happened, and the brutality of this one left the community shaken. Questions spread like wildfire. Who could have done this, and why? Officers dusted for fingerprints, collected fibers, and photographed every angle of the store. By sunrise, the investigation pointed to someone nobody had considered possible. Daniel Cross was just 12 years old. He lived less than a mile from the shop in a small house on a quiet street. He was known as a shy boy, rarely speaking in class, often seen wandering alone after school. Teachers described him as distant, sometimes troubled, but never dangerous. Yet when detectives began piecing the evidence together, Daniel's name surfaced again and again. His fingerprints were found smeared across the counter, too fresh to be explained away by an innocent visit. Under his bed, hidden inside a shoebox, police discovered a shirt stained with dried blood. The stain matched Harold's blood type. The most damning detail was the knife. Daniel often carried a pocket knife, one he had proudly carved his initials into. That knife had gone missing days before the murder, and investigators believed it was the very weapon that ended Harold's life. The townspeople couldn't believe it, but the facts seemed undeniable. A child accused of committing the most adult of crimes. The arrest sent shockwaves through Brookdale. The death sent shockwaves through Brookdale. Parents looked at their own children differently, wondering how a boy so young could be capable of such violence. Neighbors whispered about his home life, about how Daniel's father had left years earlier and his mother struggled to keep the family afloat. Others swore they had always seen something strange in his eyes, a coldness that now seemed like a warning they had ignored. The town that once felt safe now carried a stain of fear, and at the center of it stood a boy whose childhood ended the moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The trial of Daniel Cross began only months after the night that shattered Brookdale's quiet reputation. Courtrooms were rarely full in this town, but on the morning the boy walked in, wearing an oversized suit and shackles too heavy for his small frame, every seat was occupied. People craned their necks to get a glimpse of him, the accused child who had allegedly taken a man's life with cold calculation. The atmosphere felt more like a spectacle than a search for justice. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashed outside the courthouse, and headlines described the trial as something the nation had never seen before. From the very start, the prosecution painted Daniel as far more than a troubled child. They described him as calculating, obsessed with violence, and dangerously intelligent for his age. They displayed the blood-stained shirt found hidden under his bed and told the jury it was not the sign of innocence, but of concealment, an act of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. They held up photographs of the crime scene pointing to the brutality, insisting only rage and intent could explain such force. To strengthen their case, they called classmates who testified about Daniel's fascination with dark stories, his habit of doodling knives in the corners of his notebooks, and the way he sometimes laughed at violent scenes in movies when other children looked away. Each piece of testimony chipped away at the image of a boy and replaced it with the outline of a killer. The defense tried to remind everyone that Daniel was just 12 years old. They argued that children act without thinking, that they imitate what they see, that their sense of right and wrong is still developing. They questioned whether a boy his age could truly understand the permanence of death. They pointed to the lack of a direct witness and suggested that the investigation had moved too quickly, eager to find someone to blame. Yet, as the days passed, the voices of the defense seemed weaker compared to the parade of evidence and the stern tone of the prosecutor, who insisted Daniel had crossed a line that even children should never cross. Sometimes he looked down at the floor, other times his expression was unreadable, a mask that could be interpreted as guilt or simply confusion. To the public, his silence became its own form of testimony. Adults wanted to see tears, remorse, or even fear, but what they saw instead was a boy who seemed distant, unshaken, and almost detached from the weight of the trial. That detachment became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments, proof, they said, of a dangerous lack of empathy. When the trial entered its final week, tension filled the courtroom. The community's grief for Harold Greene demanded closure, and many whispered that someone had to pay, no matter the age. The jury listened to closing arguments that asked them to consider whether sparing Daniel's life meant allowing a murderer to grow older and more dangerous. The defense's plea for mercy seemed fragile against the roar of outrage outside the courthouse. By the time the jury withdrew to deliberate, Brookdale already believed it knew the outcome. The town that once pitied Daniel now waited to see if justice would treat him as a child, or as something else entirely. The day of the verdict arrived with heavy clouds hanging over Brookdale, as if the weather itself mirrored the mood of the town. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, filling the steps and spilling onto the sidewalks, waiting to hear what fate awaited the boy who had become the most infamous figure in their history. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters clutched their pens, cameras were readied, and the courtroom sat in complete silence as the jury filed back into their seats. Everyone's eyes turned toward Daniel, who sat motionless at the defense table, his feet dangling slightly above the floor because the chair was too large for his small frame. When the foreman stood to deliver the decision, the words echoed like thunder, "Guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a stillness so profound that even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. Some clutched their mouths in shock, while others nodded in grim satisfaction. But what no one anticipated was the sentence that followed. After a brief recess, the judge returned, his expression grave. He reminded the courtroom that this was an unprecedented case, that never before had someone so young stood accused of a crime so calculated. Then he pronounced the punishment that would etch itself into history: death. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, believing justice had finally been served for Harold Greene. Others wept, unable to comprehend how a child barely into adolescence could be condemned to such a fate. Daniel did not cry, nor did he protest. He simply stared straight ahead, his pale face frozen, as though he could not fully grasp the meaning of the words. His mother collapsed in her seat, wailing, while reporters stormed from the building to spread the news that would soon travel across the country. The youngest person ever sentenced to death, Brookdale instantly became the center of national attention. Television crews swarmed the town, interviewing neighbors, teachers, and anyone who claimed to have known Daniel. Some spoke of his quiet demeanor and troubled childhood, offering sympathy. Others described him as strange, cold, and destined for darkness. Politicians weighed in, some praising the sentence as proof that justice had no age limits, while others condemned it as barbaric and unfit for a modern society. Debates raged across dinner tables and talk shows. Was Daniel truly guilty beyond doubt, or had the town rushed to punish a child to soothe its own fear? Daniel was transferred to a high-security facility, a place where death row inmates waited for years. Guards escorted him past towering fences lined with barbed wire, treating him as they would any hardened criminal, though his wrists were so small that the shackles hung loose. Locked in a cell meant for adults, he became a ghostly figure in the prison system, the boy whose case no one could stop talking about. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, some begging for mercy, others filled with hate. As time passed, the sentence became more than just punishment. It became a symbol. To some, Daniel represented the possibility of evil lurking even in childhood. To others, he was a victim of fear in a broken system that valued closure over truth. Regardless of which side people stood on, one fact remained unshakable. Daniel Cross had been marked in history. The youngest death sentence of all time had been delivered, and the shadow of that decision would never fade from Brookdale, or from the memory of anyone who had witnessed it. Years after the execution, Brookdale tried to return to the ordinary life it once knew, but the memory of the trial lingered like a stain that could not be washed away. The store where Harold Greene had been killed was shuttered, its windows boarded, the shelves emptied long ago. For many, the case was closed, the story finished. But for others, questions never stopped gnawing at the edges of their thoughts. The truth, they suspected, was not as simple as the verdict had made it. And in time, details began to surface that cast the entire case in a darker, more complicated light. An investigator working on a separate case stumbled upon an overlooked statement buried in the original files. It came from an elderly woman who lived across the street from Harold's shop. She had reported seeing a man running from the store late that night, taller and older than a child, his face partially hidden by a hood. Her words had been written down, but for reasons no one ever explained, they never made it into the trial. The discovery raised uncomfortable questions. Why had her account been ignored, and why had the case against Daniel seemed so rushed? Other inconsistencies began to emerge. The knife, believed to be Daniel's, was never recovered during the investigation, but years later it was found in an abandoned shed outside of town. The blade bore no fingerprints, no clear evidence linking it directly to Daniel, but the initials carved into the handle matched his. Investigators wondered whether it had been planted or stolen long before the murder. The location where it was discovered was a place Daniel had no connection to, but one frequented by an older cousin of his, a teenager with a history of theft, fights, and violent outbursts. That cousin had been questioned briefly in the early days of the case, but was quickly dismissed as irrelevant. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the picture became. Witnesses recalled seeing the cousin in the area that night, yet their statements had been brushed aside. Records showed the cousin had once been caught shoplifting from Harold's store, fueling a grudge that could have easily escalated into something darker. And though Daniel had been painted in court as cold and calculating, people who had known him began to speak up, describing him not as violent but as withdrawn, a boy who seemed lost more than dangerous. The possibility that an innocent child had been executed began to creep into the public consciousness, though many resisted it. Accepting that the town, the jury, and the justice system had made such a mistake was too heavy a burden to carry. Officials insisted the evidence had been strong, that the verdict was justified. But as documents were reviewed and forgotten testimonies brought back into the light, it became harder to ignore the cracks in the story that once felt airtight. Whispers spread beyond Brookdale, turning the case into a subject of documentaries, academic studies, and heated debates. Was Daniel Cross truly guilty? Or had he been sacrificed in the rush to deliver justice? The truth seemed to shift with every new revelation, slipping further from certainty. The boy who had once been painted as a monster now appeared, to some as a tragic figure, perhaps a scapegoat, condemned not for what he did, but for what the town needed him to be. And though no definitive answers emerged, the shadow of doubt grew larger with each passing year, haunting Brookdale like a ghost that refused to rest. Daniel Cross never saw his 13th birthday. The execution was carried out quickly, more swiftly than most cases of its kind, as if the system wanted to erase him from existence before questions could grow too loud. His life ended in a sterile chamber, witnessed by officials and a handful of reporters who later described the scene with words that felt clinical rather than human. For Brookdale, it was supposed to mark the end of the nightmare. Justice, they believed, had been served. But instead of closure, the town was left with an uneasy silence, the kind that deepened as the years passed and the doubts multiplied. The legacy of Daniel's sentence grew larger than the town itself. Historians called it one of the darkest moments in modern justice. Activists cited it as proof of the dangers of rushing to condemn, especially when the accused was a child. Scholars dissected every detail, from the handling of evidence to the psychology of the jury, each analysis drawing attention to the cracks that had been overlooked at the time. Even those who had once cheered for the verdict began to wonder whether they had been blinded by grief and fear. For the people of Brookdale, the case became something they could not escape. The boarded-up corner store stood as a reminder of what had been lost, not only the life of Harold Greene, but also the innocence of a town that had prided itself on safety and trust. Parents who had once warned their children about strangers now whispered cautionary tales about their own neighbors, about how quickly suspicion could turn into condemnation. The name Daniel Cross became a warning, invoked in hushed tones whenever conversations drifted toward justice, guilt, or childhood gone wrong. Nationally, the story took on a haunting quality. Documentaries aired, books were written, and late-night debates circled the same unanswerable questions. Was Daniel truly guilty? Or had the real killer walked free? Each retelling kept the case alive, transforming it from a single town's tragedy into a symbol of something far larger. The youngest death sentence of all time was not remembered as a triumph of law, but as a chilling reminder of its flaws. Yet the most unsettling part was the absence of certainty. The rumors about Daniel's cousin, the overlooked witness, the misplaced evidence, none of it ever led to a definitive conclusion. The truth remained hidden in the shadows, leaving behind a story that could never be neatly closed. For some, this ambiguity was worse than the crime itself, because it meant that justice had not been achieved, only an illusion of it. Over time, the memory of Daniel Cross became less about the boy himself and more about the questions he left behind. Could a 12-year-old truly have committed such an act alone? Had the town demanded a sacrifice to soothe its fear, choosing the easiest target rather than the right one? These questions lingered unanswered, a weight carried by every person who had once believed they were witnessing justice unfold. The youngest death sentence of all time had left behind not peace, but a legacy of fear, doubt, and the haunting realization that sometimes the final word of the law is not the final word of the truth.